So I've come out today to the Mining and Industry Museum in Helper, Utah, to tell the story of the Carbon County strikes of 1903 to 1904. And what I found is that these strikes really did continue well up until World War II. And essentially they arose out of a conflict in Colorado. You had an organization trying to unionize the miners, which they did pretty successfully in the early 1900s, because these communities here in Carbon County were mostly composed of immigrants. In fact, Helper was founded by immigrants, and you had a lot of Italians and Greeks and Yugoslavs and people from all over Europe. And they come over here and they're immediately separated by their distinct nationalities, and they have nobody to really protect them from the predatory practices of the mine owners. And at the same time, strikes were arising in Colorado, and the United Mine Workers tried unionizing Colorado. And there were a bunch of different disasters here in Utah, particularly the Schofield mining disaster, which killed hundreds of people. And people started waking up to how horrible these conditions were. And at the same time, sadly, these protests started being equated with communism and insurrectionary violence, because the ones in Colorado, which were organized by the same unions as the ones here in Carbon County, turned violent, particularly with the Ludlow massacre, which many people died in. The sheriff basically came out with a posse and began shooting into the crowd of people that were protesting, essentially killing them for the fact that they didn't want to go to work in the mine for pennies a day. Not too long ago, I did a video about the labor wars up in Butte, Montana in the early 1900s, and this video got a lot of interest, so I thought I would go around west talking about a lot of the labor unions, the IWW, the UMWA, because I think it represents a fascinating subset of American sociological and political history, something that isn't really taught very often in schools. And behind me is the Schofield Cemetery. I'll put in some videos of what it looks like when it's not covered in snow, but this is significant because it was the worst mine disaster at the time to happen out west or anywhere in America. And this is because on May 1st, 1900, the mine owners invited the miners to bring their families down into the mine. And because of the horrible working conditions, the mine exploded. Now, history has sort of looked on this event with rose-colored glasses, and what a lot of people say is that people put aside their political differences and that flowers came from every different county in Utah and trains, and that people began donating coffins, and that the people from Finland came over to witness the funerals of their relatives because this was a Finnish mining community. But in reality, this event caused a lot of the miners to organize, and this is something that really isn't taught in school. In fact, the 1903-1904 Carbon County strike, which was seen at the time as a revolution, really began the Colorado strikes, which is a much more well-known labor war. And this was sparked by the Schofield mining disaster, because essentially immediately miners recognized that they were being kept in these separate communities in order so that they would not unionize. Basically, if the Finnish started protesting for better working conditions, they would say, oh, then they have elements of Bolshevism within them, and they would invite the Russians to come in and mine in their place, pitting race against race in these mining communities. But what they failed to recognize is that miners were some of the most multicultural people. You had Italians and Russians and Finnish people and Yugoslavs and African Americans all working together. And so in 1903 to 1904, they really organized, and these protests continued all the way up until the start of World War II. So that small square building was a sauna used by the Finnish miners of the area, as was this building right here. There was such a large Finnish community. And these arose into a series of wars called the Colorado Labor Wars. So even though conditions here in Utah and in Carbon County were horrid, and the people had just seen hundreds of their own men, women, and children die, or the Union support kind of died out for that period of time. However, it later was able to gain a bit of a foothold, and from the year 1900, there were about 800,000 Union members across the entire United States, but around 1904, it had by far doubled. It was now well over 2 million. So support for unionization rapidly grew after a period of apprehension towards the violence in Colorado, and eventually these movements took off into being regular members of unions, and it was kind of an accepted thing. Behind me now is one of the more powerful displays about the actual 1903-1904 strike. And I'll zoom in on some of these photos in a second, but you can see that martial law was declared simply because these guys said, we refuse to work when the conditions are so horrid that we're dying by the hundreds. In fact, the Castlegate mine had exploded recently, killing over 100 people. The Schofield mine disaster killed hundreds, and people wanted a decent pay, paid in something that was redeemable elsewhere than the company's store. And here we have the mass meeting that was a flyer sent around when they had actually declared martial law. And I think what's fascinating is that you had the possibility of the Carbon County strike becoming an uprising like what we saw in Colorado, judging from this picture up here. And this picture shows the Utah militia. Because the governor and the local sheriffs were often in the pockets of the mines, the militia was called out to fire on the Finnish miners. Basically what was happening was there were different ethnic communities set up all along these valleys, basically segregated. The Greeks live over in this mining village, the Russians here, the Italians here, and the Slavs there. And so when they were striking, the strike generally, without UMWA help, would not spread from one mining community to another unless it was a very isolated incident where the UMWA finally became involved, as they were in 03 and 04. And so they wanted to keep this from spreading, so the sheriff and the governor called out the National Guard, and tear gas and water cannons were used on Labor Day protests and Labor Day sort of parades. But in 1903, there was a strike at which the governor ordered them to fire on the protesters. But the Guard, Company F of the Utah militia, had befriended the Finnish miners and persuaded the Finnish miners to not do anything violent, to lay low, and to not really do anything that would cause the sheriff or local officials to provoke any further. They understood that they were just moments away from being shot, and this could have been another war in Utah. And in fact, behind me, this really points it out. There were actually machine guns posted on the mountains around me. And of course these people were living here more or less as slave labor. When you only got paid company money that you could only use at the company store, and the company schools charged you more than your salary to raise your children, and all of these factors together, they literally couldn't leave because they were in debt to the company. And if you tried to leave, they would pursue you and heavily intimidate you. In fact, strikers were prodded with the barrels of guns by mine workers, by mine guards rather, and they persuaded different ethnic groups to come in, which just pitted one ethnicity against another, something the UMWA has worked against and continues to work against in the case of migrant workers. In fact, at the time, the strikes in Carbon County were equated with a total insurrection. They called it the Uprising in Carbon County. And this is not very much talked about today because it is by far overshadowed by similar labor uprisings on the East Coast with the mine wars in Appalachia, you know, the Harlan County strikes and the West Virginia Blair Mountain battle, which the sheriff dropped bombs on his own people from airplanes. But this is now a display of United Mine Workers of America. And what I think is so fascinating is that a lot of these museums that commemorate mining, of course not this one, but there are museums in Colorado which have faced some pretty sturdy criticism because they don't really talk about the miners themselves, they talk about the mine owners. But this museum here in Helper has done an excellent job at showing the struggles that these miners went through to unionize, to have activism towards disability, towards pensions, towards a fair work week, towards, you know, equitable hours and pay. And even, you know, it was considered revolutionary at the time, but not being paid in scrib, which is currency that you can only turn in at the company store, you know. I'm in debt to the company store. But fascinating displays, and I really recommend this museum for anybody who's coming through town, as well as any Wild West tourists, because Butch Cassidy and his crew has a big story here around in southern Utah and Carbon County. I mentioned a little bit earlier that members from the United Mine Workers of America organization would ferry often back and forth from Colorado to Carbon County, Utah, and this would help fight for a fair work week, for an equitable wage, and for proper pensions for the miners, as well as for disability. And Mother Jones spent her entire life doing this, and in fact the reason why she's called Mother Jones is because a lot of these hardworking miners really viewed her as sort of a mother figure. And eventually, when the organization, the UMWA, started to take violent steps in Colorado after the Ludlow massacre, when the sheriff went out and massacred the miners simply for sitting down and refusing to work, there was a war that broke out all throughout Colorado called the Labor War, and dozens of people died, mostly on the side of the unions, and people were actually giving orders and calls to arms. It was considered a real war, and because these people were ferrying back and forth from Colorado to Utah, it sort of started souring the public perception. And these protests did continue well up until the 1930s and 40s, but it was never the same as what it was in the early part of the 1900s. But Mother Jones still is considered a legendary figure for the working people. There's a section in the Price City Cemetery which is devoted almost entirely to Greek people, specifically people from the Isle of Crete. And the story goes that around 2005, a local who is of Greek descent was studying the history of some of the Greek migrants in the area. And he discovered that the number 2 Castlegate mine explosion in 1924 killed 29 Greek workers. And these workers had no family in the local area and nobody to remember them, so it was almost entirely lost. And so, with the funds that he raised from the local Greek church, he helped get together $1,700 and finally gave them a headstone to mark who they were specifically. And he also made sure to go around and find the names that had been anglicized and actually change them back to Greek names so that hopefully in the future their family can come over and see the sacrifices that their great-great-grandfathers made. And this is a particularly powerful grave of one of the Greek immigrants here who died fighting for America at Iwo Jima on March 8th, 1945. In fact, if you walk around the Price City Cemetery looking specifically for people who died in these mine disasters, you'll find a lot of immigrants and even a lot of locals, such as the man next to me, who died in 1941. And it's fascinating to go, and especially for the graves of immigrants, to hope that perhaps their families could have come here and seen the sacrifices made by their distant relatives who were almost certainly sending the money back home from the American West. Next to me now is the memorial to the 1924 Castlegate mine explosion. Now, I visited the cemetery pretty recently because most of the bodies that couldn't be shipped out were actually buried right in front of the mine, which I believe is still active. And you have here a beautiful design, a memorial created by an 11-year-old as a school project. And one of the things that it notes is that the youngest victim of the disaster was only 16 years old, and he was a relative of the child who created this. And this is some of the lead up to a general understanding that the safety conditions within these mines were totally abhorrent. And if you take a look throughout this, you can see the location of where these bodies were found. And it's amazing to me that an 11-year-old could have gathered all of this data and actually created something so moving. Right now we're at the site of the Castlegate mine disaster, which is one of the worst mine disasters to ever strike America.
Bandiera,
Here again in Carbon County, the reason why Castle Gate is called Castle Gate is because to get to it through the railroad, which you can see maybe just down over the right side of the road there, you have to pass through this rock formation. And this, right now we're looking north towards Salt Lake, but you would pass through this on the railroads to get to Price and Helper in Utah. And this would be one of the things you'd see if you were a miner. And we're going right through it now. On June 15th, 1925, a guard for the Castle Gate mine was shot 5 times and beaten over the head with a pistol, and he would later die the next day, but 3 children in the local area reported that they saw a black man running, and that was all of the really justification they needed to form a lynch mob. And you have to keep in mind that this sort of coincides with the anti-union sentiment and the anti-immigrant sentiment that was kind of bubbling up from the surrounding communities in 1925. And so they quickly discovered that a man was running from the law, probably because he was just an itinerant black worker from Arkansas, and he was running from the law and he hid out in his friend's cabin, another fellow black worker. And this friend was immediately afraid of the fact that this lynch mob could discover him, so he went over to the office at the Castlegate mine and just told him that Robert Marshall was hiding out in his cabin, probably trying to distance himself from his friend as much as possible, which is understandable. He didn't want to be lynched as well. So the sheriff comes down with a posse to arrest him, with about 9 people in the posse, and by the time they drive to the courthouse, a mob has assembled, and they called it a necktie party. So basically, he was going to go into the courthouse, and the sheriff unwisely let him out of the car. There were about 1,000 people in the mob, and they blocked his entry from the courthouse. So Marshall, understandably very shaken up, moves back around to get into the car with the sheriff, but the crowd quickly overtakes the car, hijacks it, takes it 2 miles east of Price, and hangs Robert Marshall. Marshall was later buried in this section of the cemetery, which used to be outside of the cemetery walls. However, as the cemetery expanded, they rediscovered his story and erected a proper headstone, which now reads, "Lynched June 18th, 1925, a victim of intolerance, may God forgive." And in the same room, right next to the Mother Jones photo, behind me you have an infographic showing some of the concrete things that the UMWA has achieved over the years. And the photo in front of me, the previous graphic which I showed, they generally show pictures of Helper and Price and this sort of Carbon County activism that was had at the hands of the UMWA. But behind me you can see, for example, this is the first pension ever received by a UMWA member, which only happened in 1948. And at the time, the man was in his 60s. And this mining had been going on for generations, so it's kind of crazy that nobody ever really received a pension, and it wasn't something that you could turn into a career unless you were something of a mine owner. And you have plenty of information here about black lung and wages, and actually the 1969 Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, which is funny because that was never enacted until the late 1960s. A lot of this really shows that without union activism and labor organizing, we would have no recognition of workers' rights. We would have nobody here to actually stand up and say, what about all the miners that got black lung working for pennies on the dollar? What are you going to do to help them? Because without unions, the mine owners would have just kicked them to the curb. Behind me now, overlooking Park City, Utah, is the Silver King mine, which is the last mine that Joe Hill worked in before he was executed by the state of Utah in 1915, basically because he was a revolutionary labor activist. His story goes that he was born Hagaland in Sweden in 1879, and in the early 1900s he came over to New York like many immigrants on a sailboat, and when he got there he took the name Joe Hill. And the reason he took this very simple, easy to forget, nondescript name is because he was an activist for the International Workers of the World. This organization still exists, but back in the day they were openly getting into battles with sheriffs, they were planting bombs inside of the homes of magnates for coal and oil companies, and they were basically a industrial general union for every kind of worker you can imagine. They believed in a general union, and they created the concept of one big union. And because of that, a lot of people saw them as socialists and communists, and Joe Hill learned the English language traveling from New York over to the West Coast on trains. He was a hobo, and along the way he picked up the hobby of folk singing, and he did so as a worker of the world. They called them wobblies for reasons which are now unclear. And he picked up singing, and he started singing things like Preacher and the Slave, where he created the phrase pie in the sky. He sung The Rebel Girl, he sung Casey Jones the Union Scab, and he became really popular. And when he was over there in Washington, he took part in the free speech fights, and these began when the workers would go up on a soapbox and say, "I'm a wobbly," and they would start reading the Constitution. And then the sheriff would come along and arrest them, put them in jail, and beat them. A lot of them would die of typhoid in jail. They would be there for long times with no real charges, and this was kind of seen by the Union at the time as a way of declaring war against them and subjecting them to lynch mobs, basically. Some of these floors are kind of very flimsy wood, so be careful if you come up here. And I thought I'd actually come out inside of the Silver King mine to talk about the tactic that Joe Hill devised, which became legendary. It was what he is now known for. When you would go out to these free speech battles, you would have a sanctioned protest, you'd be allowed to be there in front of City Hall or wherever, and then the mining interests, the people who were industrialists, they would hire the American Legion or the Salvation Army to show up and drown you out by singing Christian hymns. And then if you approached them and said, "You're not allowed to be here, go away, we're sanctioned to be here," it would often quickly escalate and the two groups would begin fighting. But of course, because the sheriff and the police and the law enforcement are all also in the hands of the business interests, they would arrest the wobblies who were allowed to be there. So what Joe Hill realized was, I know simple English. I know how to keep a tune to the same Christian hymns these guys are singing. Why don't we sing it in the Baptist style? So they began singing the same tune, but with a industrial socialist or unionist message right over the top of the Salvation Army and the American Legion. And they'd go out there and they'd drown them out. And two of Joe Hill's most famous songs, The Preacher and the Slave and There Is Power to Union, were both set to Christian hymns. But Joe Hill really was through and through a hobo, and he was drifting back and forth, and his last mine that he started the employment of in 1913 or 14 was the one behind me. And around 1914, somebody, they say it was Joe Hill, but somebody walked into a mercantile store in downtown Salt Lake, and there were two people. They held up the grocer and his son, and they shot them both, killing them. Well, later that day, Joe Hill walked into a doctor's office with a bullet hole in his stomach, and he said, "I got shot in a fight. You know, can you patch me up?" Now, 4 other people had walked into the same doctor's office in downtown Salt Lake with bullet wounds. It was 1914. And the doctor said, "You know, Joe, you're a wobbly. They're going to be after you for this murder." And Joe kind of saw the need of becoming a martyr for the wobblies, and that's exactly what he became. There were other union activists who were killed in Salt Lake around the same time, but Joe Hill became a martyr because he refused to say who shot him. He refused to say what were the details of him being shot after he was accused. Before he was accused, he said, "You know, I got into a fight over this girl, and I held my arms up, and he shot me, so I ran and went to go seek help." And the autopsy, or the examination, proved this. The bullet hole in his shirt was 4 inches above the wound in his
in his torso. So he clearly had his hands up like this. He couldn't have taken part in this robbery. But because he was a wobbly, the state accused him, and even though you had officials in Washington, D.C. saying Joe Hill is clearly innocent, the governor of Utah sentenced him to death. And Joe Hill only leaned into it. He refused to say, because it would be very easy to clear it up by saying, I got into a fight over a girl with this other Swedish immigrant working in the mines, and we were in Salt Lake, and he shot me right here, and here's the guy's name, here's the girl's name, they both saw it. They probably all understood the need for a radical union. And this also speaks volumes to the radicalism that would have been circulating amongst Swedish immigrants and European immigrants that were working in mines like the one behind me, because they all saw the need to keep their mouth shut so Joe Hill would be martyred. Well, after he was martyred, his ashes were brought back to the Wobbly headquarters in Chicago. They were founded there in 1905, and they were distributed, as per his wishes, to all over the world, 600 different places in 600 envelopes. And decades later, in I believe the 60s or 70s, one of these envelopes was found, and it was labeled as controversial, subversive material, propaganda. So they just shelved it in the post office, but decades later they found it, and they brought it out to Columbine, Colorado, where a massacre of mine workers happened. Now, the Columbine Mine Massacre of 1927, as briefly as I'll go into it, it was a strike, and they were waving flags, the Wobblies were, and it was kind of also overlapping with the Western Federation of Miners because, the Wobblies were an early proponent of general unionism. They would interact with a lot of anarchist, communist, or just regular union groups. They were waving a flag, and the scabs shot the guy who was waving the flag, killing quite a few people. And there were something like 19 bullet holes in this flag, and it fell down on the kid who was waving it. He was just a young guy. And they brought his ashes over there, and they scattered it as they created the monument. They have a tombstone for the Columbine Mine Massacre now. And other people, as with the AFL-CIO, they actually had some of his ashes, and they had a ceremony where around the same time period, decades later, they all drank it in a, wooded ceremony off in the forest, and they said that that was them taking on the soul of Joe Hill to continue his struggle for international industrial unionism. And the story of Joe Hill is probably just the story of a hobo who heavily leaned into becoming a martyr for the international workers of the world back when the Wobblies truly meant something. And he just found himself at a crossroads of history where he became a martyr for the cause. And the Wobblies gained a lot of attention after this, and their membership went through the roof. Some of these floors are kind of very flimsy wood, so be careful if you come up here. Very flimsy. Man, I'm going to be careful on this. There's not even any nails in there. Look at that. I want to see if this is a mine shaft. And I'm looking right now from the gates of the mine. You can see a deer just crossed the path there. This is where the workers would come every morning to enter the Silver King mine. And up there you probably have some old mine payroll buildings, and all around me you have basically ski jumps. Park City now is no longer a mining town, it's a skiing town, and the property value has definitely gone up accordingly.
And never fall into the trap of believing that these unsafe working conditions and lack of care for mine management doesn't exist, because here to my left we have a memorial to the Wilburg mine disaster, which happened not even a week from Christmas in 1984 in the local area.